Hello, and welcome to our lecture here on Chapter 6. Here in this lecture, we're going to be focusing on issues of criminal justice policy. And for many of you that are thinking that a criminal justice class is just about the law and police and courts and the correction system, policy is an intricate part of all of that because policy is what tells us, in many cases, the types of programs to use, the way in which our sentencing practices should be constructed, the way in which police officers should do their jobs. So, policy is really a crucial role here in our criminal justice system. They really provide guidance to our officials. And it can be particularly useful in cases where there are high levels of discretion on the job. And in many cases, policies can serve as kind of the rules that workers use in order to do their job. Now, we need criminal justice policies because this is what helps us address the different types of issues that we're facing. It helps us handle offenders and things like that. Now, the federal government is an active player in the creation of crime control policies. And so that's something that's important to remember as we think about how policies are formed and really why they are formed. We spend billions of dollars nationwide annually that support kind of the enterprise of criminal justice, if you will. So, for example, in 2011, the Department of Justice budget model included $27.1 billion in discretionary funding that they could kind of dole out to agencies and communities and research and the like. So that's a lot of money to kind of put around. So I want to start today looking at the policy development process. And there are 6 stages in this. The first stage, we start with problem identification. So, we have to have a problem that we know about in order to respond to it with a policy. We also look at some of what might be some of the demands of a policy, how an agenda kind of forms around this, and then ultimately how these are adopted, implemented, and evaluated. So let's take a look at each of these stages in detail. So here at the top, we talk about identifying a policy or planning for it, right? Now, this is something that, you need to have a problem identified. Something like maybe that crime rates are rising, or maybe we have a need for particular types of prison rehab programs, or communities and politicians are concerned about residency requirements for convicted sex offenders, right? These are all problems that we might identify related to our criminal justice system, right? And there's going to be debates about what some of the demands are here, right? What should this policy look like, right? And we have to think about what are some of the goals or objectives here, right? Are we thinking, for example, that particular crimes need to have an increased punishment? Are we thinking that we want to find ways to increase community safety, and how do we do that, right? So as we are forming an agenda about a particular policy, right? This is very political. In fact, this is really kind of the most political stage in all of this. It can involve a variety of different voices, from government officials to special interest groups. It could involve victims' family members, members of the general community, different agents in the criminal justice system. And so everybody is kind of jumping in and dogpiling, if you will, right? And kind of put their 2 cents in about what they think about the policy. Now, as you're thinking about kind of how do we adopt it, right? Now, this could involve, for example, the passage of new laws or the signing of an executive order by a governor or a president, right? Now, once a policy is adopted, it can sit there, right? You have to put it into action, and action often needs spending money, right? And a lot of times we pass policies and they might be hot button issues that things are very passionate about and very emotional, and we don't think about the actual costs of this, right? I think about sometimes related to this some of the features of Jessica's Law, which sounds like a really important law. It was a sex offender notification law related to GPS tracking, right? Making all offenders wear a GPS tracking monitor. Well, the problem is that when a lot of policies that were related to this were passed, nobody thought about, well, who's going to pay for the GPS trackers and who's going to pay to monitor these sort of things. And so that sometimes is where, when you're talking about actually implementing the policy and the costs associated with it, that's sometimes where you might have some differences between what the kind of intent of a policy was, or how politicians and the public thought about a policy and how it is actually implemented here, right? We sometimes call this street level bureaucracy, right, where what actually happens on the streets is different than what happened in a policy development stage. So you can see that there's significant challenges that arise here. Now, when we think about evaluating a policy, and this to me, of course, as a scholar and a researcher, is one of the most important stages, and unfortunately it's something that often gets left out. It's one of these things that we think about at the end, and I would actually argue that this should be much earlier in the process. But the reality is that we tend to think about what works after the fact, right? We have certainly a history of examples where we've passed policies thinking that they would work, and we don't necessarily have research to show that such a policy would, in fact, be effective, right? Policymakers don't always know what the cutting edge research says about, the types of programs and strategies that they're proposing. They don't necessarily know what is really effective about reducing crime rates. They just think they do. And so a lot of times scholars are left looking at whether or not a policy is effective after it's been implemented. And we do this in a couple of different ways. Well, first off, we think about a process evaluation. And now process is saying we're looking at the progression about how policy is developed, how programs are created and put into place, right? So that's kind of the pre-part of it. Now, outcome evaluation, we're looking there at data or experiences about changes that occur as a result of the policy, right? So an example here might be how a number of states have implemented drug testing for welfare recipients. And what we have found in every state that has conducted an analysis of this policy is that we actually spent far more money drug testing individuals than we actually ever identified individuals who were substance abuse addicted and trying to obtain welfare resources. In fact, we often find zero or very few people that test positive for drugs. And so we spend an obscene amount of money because we perceive that this is a major issue. We perceive that there's a bunch of people freeloading off of government resources. And when we look at the research on that, we find that it just isn't true. And so, as I said, to me, evaluation is the most important stage, but it's often overlooked, underemphasized, thought of as a very last minute add-on rather than something that is integrated at the beginning. Well, let's think about who is developing these policies, right? I've alluded a little bit that this is a very political process, right? So we can think about the different players that are involved in politics, right? Whether that be a member of Congress that introduces a bill or at the federal level, or a state member at a state level. And then kind of similar in that difference there, right? You have a governor at a state level or a president that can kind of be involved in this process. There was a recent piece of legislation that was introduced by several senators at the federal level, looking at providing resources for women who are incarcerated in federal prisons. Now, this specific resource was talking about sanitary napkins for women who are menstruating, right? Currently in federal prison, these things, inmates had to pay for this, right? they weren't provided for them, right? And you start going into this whole conversation about needs versus wants and medical care and all of these other things. Also embedded into this policy was conversations and policies about things like shackling, handcuffing and shackling somebody during childbirth. I don't know if you've ever seen a woman in labor, but I'm just going to go with, yeah, I wasn't moving anywhere during that process, right? But we have had a history of states handcuffing and shackling prisoners who are pregnant during labor. So, which actually does put a health risk to the woman as well as her child. So those are just kind of some examples about politicians being involved. We also have a system of direct democracy, right? So in about 17 different states, we have processes where citizens are empowered to make law through an initiative process. And certainly California, we do that quite often here. We are one of those 17 states that engages in direct democracy. If you think back to the 2016 election, right, there were a number of different initiatives on the California state ballot that were looking at criminal justice policies. We actually had two different initiatives related to the death penalty, one of which passed and one of which did not, right? And so those are examples of direct democracy. Another example is now how you have to go to the grocery store and you have to pay 10 cents for a plastic bag. That is an example of direct democracy at work. Obviously, that's not a criminal justice policy, but I just throw that out there because everybody can immediately connect that experience, right? Here in California, we have other examples of direct democracy related to criminal justice, things like 3 strikes, you're out, some of the stuff related to prison and offender reclassification and prison overcrowding and such like that. Our marijuana legalization, that's another example of direct democracy. So let's think a little bit about, now that we know who, let's talk about why, right? So why do we develop some of these? Well, we have to think about what are the goals of these, right? And a number of these, as I've mentioned, involve changing the way in which offenders are processed by the criminal justice system. So maybe we want to be retributive, right? We want to be tougher on crime. And so that's how we think about changing criminal justice policies. You know, a great example of that there is certainly our 3 strikes policies on sentencing, right? The whole 3 strikes, you're out, where that 3rd felony sends you to prison for 25 years to life. And that was an idea of making harsher punishments for habitual offenders. Maybe we're changing the definitions of criminal behavior, right? We've seen that here in California as well, where we've changed the way in which, you know, marijuana, right? Used to be illegal, now it's legal, right? We're changing the definitions there. We can also change some of the responses by police agencies to crime or even correctional officials kind of response to crime in there. And finally, we might have some that are cost saving, right? We've seen that in a number of cases, right? Again, kind of going back to the 2016 election, both of those death penalty measures, we're talking about, oh, we're going to save cost. We're going to do so in different ways. And there certainly has been a lot of debate about whether or not the one that passed will in fact save money. There's a lot of arguments saying that in fact this is only going to increase the costs and increase the bureaucracy of carrying out executions. But that's something that we'll just have to see what happens there. The measure that failed did talk about saving $150 million every year to the state of California had we abolished the death penalty. But so certainly we're looking at fiscal concerns there. When we think about our policies and kind of how they're planned and how they're formed, right, and how the role of politics comes in here, right, we have to remember that we have, generally speaking, 2 camps on, you know, really any type of policy. But since we're talking about criminal justice policy here, right, we have liberals who are certainly focused on the importance of due process in our system. there's very much a focus on individual freedoms as well as the individual's constitutional rights. Now, you compare that to a conservative perspective, and those politics tend to lean towards less intervention by the government and a focus on kind of, quote, traditional values, right? So it is certainly, given those differences in kind of their political foundations, it's not surprising to say that liberals and conservatives tend to think differently about criminal justice policy. We also have kind of the role of presidential politics on criminal justice policy, which is interesting because the president actually has very little power when it comes to making policy, right? And the goal actually of kind of presidential politics here is to persuade members of Congress to pass new laws and that sort of thing, right? But we started seeing, for example, like during the 1930s, this conversation about criminal justice issues, and in particular, the 1930s, when we had the Wickersham Commission created to look at issues within policing, and that was a presidential commission. Now, it wasn't until Richard Nixon's campaign that crime became kind of a key component of the presidential platform, and he declared a war on crime. It's somewhat ironic, given about how he left the Oval Office, that was his platform, but it was, right? And then after that, we started to see more and more presidents talking about criminal justice policies and kind of getting tough on crime, right? You go to Ronald Reagan and his whole, just say no to drug abuse, right? The get tough on crime really became a central point during the 1988 presidential elections between George Bush and Michael Dukakis, right, with the conversation of furlough releases for prisoners. There was a very high-profile case in the state where, that basically led to a individual being murdered by an offender who was out on furlough, and that actually became a very central theme of that time, sort of thing. And then, finally, think about Congress, right? Between 50 years, between 1946 and 1996, we had 3,373 different congressional hearings held on crime. I would argue that number has actually continued to increase on an annual basis, right? So there's a lot of discussion, particularly post 9/11 on terrorism, right? All of those hearings. We think about the number of hearings that went on related to Title IX and campus sexual assault, or issues of racial politics and police shootings, right? So lots of activity that goes on within Congress on these sort of things. Now, it's interesting that research tells us that the only variables that seem to influence these discussions, both in terms of content as well as frequency, are the crime rate, right? So as the crime rate goes up, we see more policy discussions on crime. And during the election year, right? Crime is one of those issues that really resonates with people during elections. And so we see that that really has an impact there. Now, we also can see that presidential politics will impact the actions of Congress in the following year, right? And so there is kind of a cyclical relationship to that. And then finally, the public, right? Communities, us, individuals, right? We all have an influence on criminal justice policies. And a lot of times what the public believes, whether that's true or accurate, certainly things that the media kind of puts out there about crime, can impact our policies about crime. And so we actually can see how this public perceptions kind of reflect, it's kind of a reflection about changes in our government structure, right? So certainly the way in which we've looked at juvenile crime over time, whether it's been very, like if you do the crime, you do the time, or if it's, they're kids, they should be treated as such in a very rehabilitative way. So that we do see that the public perception, right, that plays a big role, right? Congressional individuals, right, they're theoretically listening to the public and what they think, and often they're responding to their constituencies' concerns, and as a result, introducing new policies and discussions about criminal justice issues. That's what we have here today for Chapter 6. Thanks so much, and we'll see you later.